Israel's Haredi community has been largely exempt from the national draft since the founding of the state. But with mounting casualties in Israel's defensive wars, continued low Haredi conscription, and a helping hand from Israel's legal system, the exemption is now a key point of controversy within the governing coalition. Time is ticking as Israel attempts to grapple with the complex questions of national security, Jewish and national identity, economic sustainability, and of course, the rule of law. You should know the law and the facts. I'm Aylana Meisel, and this is Basic Law. At 14% of Israel's population, Israel's Ultra-Orthodox or Haredi community present a strategic and economic challenge for the state. This quick-growing but insular minority is not well integrated into broader society. At the current rate of growth, Haredim are projected to comprise 16% of the Israeli public by 2032 and 40% of Israeli Jewry in 40 years. Today, 20% of all Israeli school children are already Haredi. Almost no Haredim serve in the IDF. Only 53% of Haredi men participate in the Israeli workforce, and the average Haredi family receives more in state subsidy than it pays in taxes. Concerns regarding economic integration and calls to equalize the burdens of military service have persisted for years, and a series of pivotal Supreme Court decisions have alternately catalyzed and disrupted attempts to reach political compromise on these issues. Nonetheless, various Haredi leaders have used their outsized political power to maintain the community's insulation. In fact, both Haredi support for judicial reform and the significant public blowback to it were motivated by the idea that a more limited judiciary could mean a permanent Haredi draft exemption. But times have changed. In the past 17 months, hundreds of thousands of Israelis have been called to serve extraordinary amounts of reserve service, and anger is growing across Israeli society, even among traditional allies of the Haredim. The IDF's manpower needs have also grown dramatically, and a majority of the Israeli public seeks to end the exemption to the Haredi community once and for all. Haredi leadership sees its way of life threatened. The coalition itself is fragmented on how to handle this issue and racing to reach compromise, while Israel's legal system remains a dominant player on this sensitive political question. Today, we speak to Rabbi Yehoshua Pfeffer, Executive Director of the Haredi Iyun Institute, to make sense of it all. Rabbi, thank you very much for joining us today.
Great pleasure, Aylana. Good to be here.
So, I think we first need to be clear about the fact that we've known each other for a good number of years. We're sort of colleagues. Each of us run projects and the cultivation of conservative leadership in different audiences. And I hope that camaraderie will express itself over the course of this long and complicated conversation. But I would love for you to introduce yourself to the viewers, please.
Okay, thank you. Very briefly, I'm Yehoshua Pfeffer. I grew up in England, came here when I was 17 to study in the yeshiva system in Israel, the Haredi yeshiva system. Mainly ended up studying in Meir, kind of all roads lead to Meir yeshiva in the end, or to Brisk, but mine led to Meir. Got married here. My wife and her family are Haredi Israeli there. My wife grew up here, and I really became an organic part of Haredi Israeli society. I studied Torah for many years, became a rabbinical judge alongside other halachic roles. Later on decided to branch out a bit, studied law at Hebrew University, clerked at the Supreme Court, became very involved in, you could call it, Haredi activism, different social projects related to the integration of Haredim into Israel. And after a while of being involved in setting up yeshivas and in academia and other projects, I set up the Iyun Institute, which has our own journal. We have educational programs. We have hundreds and hundreds of wonderful alums. We have a range of publications trying to think about how do we imagine a Haredi society that's taking responsibility for Israel in a deep way. The fact of Haredim being a part of Israel is going to happen either way. The big question is, how will it happen? In which sense will it happen? What can Haredim actually contribute towards Israel? And will it happen in a way which is healthy, productive, in a way that Haredim can maintain a lot that's good and beautiful, but also translate it into Hebrew, into cultural Hebrew, into being a part of Israel. And this is mainly what I do today. I'm also a community rabbi. I also teach at Hebrew University's law school. So a number of hats.
I'm glad that you have fit us into your 28-hour-a-day schedule.
Well, this is important. Happy to be here.
I agree. It's an incredibly important story for Israel. And so let's move to substance, okay? And with a small disclaimer that part of what we're going to do today is discuss the legal aspect to the story of the Haredim, not exclusively. But in so doing, I don't want to sort of exempt, no pun intended, the Haredi community or political actors or anybody else who's had a role in getting us to the sort of balagan, the mess that we find ourselves in today. This is a very, very complex issue. And to really solve it going forward, we need to understand the entire picture. And that, I think, is really the animating desire today in this conversation. So,
yeah, let me. Sorry to come in already.
Ready?
Sorry to come in already. But just to point out, I get on so many different interviews and panel discussions and so on about the Haredi draft. Among other things, I also chair today Netzach Yehuda, which is an organization that supports Haredim in the IDF. So I do have a lot of history and experience in this issue. However, I look forward to this conversation because it's rare that I get asked about the judicial component of this, the judicial element, which I think is very important. It's important to bring it up, important to speak about it. It also allows me to draw on two areas of my expertise, both my judicial background, meaning judicial, my background in the law and at the Supreme Court, and also my experience with Netzach Yehuda and my general Haredi experience. So I look forward to actually putting a bit of emphasis on the law issues. They're very important.
100% agreed.
Good.
Let's start with a little bit of a zoom out, though. What do people need to know about the Haredi community itself when they look at this issue of the exemptions? What do you need to know just about Haredi lifestyle and Haredi identity, right, when you're trying to analyze this issue?
Okay, so obviously there's a lot that's been written and much to be said about this. Very, very briefly, I'll say that Haredim, from the inception of the State of Israel, and even before, Haredim have traced a parallel track to the State of Israel, to the Zionist track. Haredim, from their perspective, are trying to perpetuate something that we've lived for the last 2,000 years of exile, meaning trying to perpetuate, to continue a way of life, a trajectory, which is deeply embedded into the tradition of 2,000 years of exile, while Israel is trying to do something entirely new, a shift, a transition from powerlessness to power, a transition from exilic to upright to strong, to looking at the world, looking at Judaism in a completely different way. It's not just another secular movement. Zionism is a movement that also envisions what it means to be Jewish in a different light, a national Jew rather than a religious, some will call it an ethnic model, but a religious model. And it's really an entirely different internal motion. And the army, of course, represents the spearhead of that movement. Not for nothing, Ben Gurion saw the army as this melting pot to create, to shape the image of the new Jew. And the Haredim are very afraid of that. There are a number of reasons why Haredim don't serve in the IDF. One of them, of course, is because they can. Let's be honest and say that the government has enabled, has empowered this non-service of Haredim. Haredim can not serve in the army, and that's a convenient place to be. So that's one reason. Another reason is because Haredim see what they do as being very, very central, crucial for the Jewish people, for the State of Israel. Torah study, religious devotion, this maintenance of this way of life that we've had for 2,000 years. Haredim see that as very important, but perhaps the most central reason or the most prominent reason is this, the fear that if you go into the army, you lose your basic identity, which is a community, Haredi identity that predicates a certain way of life, that continues a certain track, which is different from the Israeli track. Once you're in the army, even if it's a Mahadrin army, even if it's an army that's going to facilitate being Haredi, quote unquote, which is what you have now in, for example, the Hashmonaim, Hasmonean.
This is the new unit that they've...
New brigade.
New brigade.
A brigade, which is it's a wonderful concept, the notion of being, from the Haredi perspective, you don't have to mix with everyone else. You don't have, today we have a battalion, Netzach Yehuda, which is a part of Kfir, which is a big brigade, and it's never going to be hermetic. This is a full brigade, a Haredi brigade. It's like the Haredi dream. And nevertheless, you go into the army, irrespective of where you're going to be, you're going to become an Israeli patriot. You're going to shift lines from the Haredi line to the Israeli line, or to blend those two lines. And the Haredi leadership, the rabbinic leadership, political leadership, is very anxious about what happens next. It's not simple. And that's why you have this tremendous tension over the army issue, more than all other issues, more than the workforce issue, more than the question of academic education, even more than school education. The army raises this tremendous tension within the Haredi space.
So the fact remains, though, that even though the army is really the tip of the spear, the spearheads, the integration into the workforce is low, at least on the part of Haredi men. They're standing at around 53%, women much higher. And there's also a very low rate of study in academia, making you a particularly rare unicorn. So there's a broader interest in maintaining this very tight insulation to the extent possible on the Haredi side. What was the Israeli interest in granting that exemption to begin with, and how has that continued?
Yeah, so, initially we're talking about very low figures, low numbers.
At the founding of a state.
Yeah, at inception, we're talking about very small numbers, 500-600 boys that received their exemption from the draft, a very, very small educational system that received autonomy. It's really it's the understanding that this is going to be a museum. From Ben-Gurion's perspective, when he gave all of these concessions to the Haredim, that really empowered this kind of isolationist motion of Haredi society and allowed the Haredim to develop these autonomous communities and later on autonomous cities. I'm talking about big cities. Yerushalayim, Jerusalem. Neighborhoods in Jerusalem are predominantly Haredi today. We're talking about Bnei Brak, and then we're talking about Beitar Illit and Modi'in Illit, Kiryat Sefer, and Elad, and there are more coming. But all of this, from Ben-Gurion's perspective, was a museum, meaning there was no imagination that the trajectory, the path of religiosity among the Jewish world, within the Jewish world, will suddenly shift. The spiral had been a downward spiral in terms of religious observance, in terms of religiosity. And from Ben-Gurion's perspective, he wanted to allow the Haredim to rebuild, to rehabilitate the decimated Torah world. But that was it. It was going to be a museum. All of a sudden, it just picked up. All of a sudden, it just suddenly, mushroomed and became this huge society that we know today. And there are many reasons why that happened. I don't think we want to get into all those reasons now. But what happened was that this initial impulse of Ben-Gurion to say, fine, take your autonomy, take your army exemptions, has become something which encroaches, meaning this thin line that you had at the beginning, a parallel line to the rest of Israel, has become thicker and thicker and wider, and it's begun to encroach upon the rest of Israeli society to become a real issue for Israel's future. Many will say this is an existential issue for Israel's future. I think that's true, both on an economic level, on the army level, but also on the fabric of Israeli society level, meaning the greater the share of the Haredim in Israel's population, today let's say it's more or less 14%, the greater that this will be a real tension and a question mark concerning the future of Jewish Israel. Will we be able to work together for those projects and for those initiatives that are so key to our collective future here? And the trouble is that the initial starting position has never really changed from the official perspective, from the perspective of the law, from the perspective of the education. At the same time, I have to say, in the field, things are changing. You speak about 53 or 54%. Don't forget that in the year 2000 or 2002, Haredi men were integrated into the workforce at a level of 35%, meaning much lower. So it's grown 20% over those years. Haredi women, their share in the workforce has grown. They now work to the same level as non-Haredi Jewish women.
Well over 80%, yeah.
Same share, even though their salary is less, and the salary of Haredi men is more or less half the Haredi of non-Haredi Jewish men. So it's not just about the participation, it's also the type of participation. But things are changing in those fields, both in terms of workforce, in terms of academia, in terms of the mamach, these new Haredi state schools where you study co-curriculum studies. All these things are developing, and that's happening from the field. It's happening from the field, not because of any laws, but rather because the size, the level of isolation, which is impossible to maintain today, the Israelism, this process of Haredim becoming more Israeli, that's happening from the field. And I do envisage that continuing to change. I'm a part of that, but obviously there are many others who are a part of trying to push that ahead, but in the most healthy possible way, in the most productive possible way.
So I think that is an extremely positive and good message to convey. I do want to push back a little bit because, let's say, with the rate of integration of the men into the workforce, the rate is stagnating at the moment, for instance. And as you know, the IDF now says that it needs significantly more manpower. There's kind of an internal war within the coalition and between the coalition and the Attorney General's office as to how to best proceed in terms of codifying new rules on a draft. But something like 10,000 draft orders have already been sent out. The response has been negligible. It's been fewer than 400 people, I believe, responded to the first two rounds. And the army itself has already said that it doesn't believe that it will hit its kind of new targets of drafting not just 1,800 Haredi men of the 60+ thousand that are eligible for the draft, but they were hoping to draft another 3,000 this year. So I don't want in any way to undercut the progress that's been made, and I think that both you and I agree that incremental progress moving in the right direction is perhaps the healthiest in many different situations. But how do you reconcile what you're saying with that picture?
So first of all, it's I'll make a couple of important points, or points that I think are important. First of all, I absolutely understand the lack of patience on this. People are angry, people are resentful. Yesterday I gave a talk to a group of religious Zionist educators, principals of schools. They invited me to give a talk, and these are people who are allies. You know, they're friends of the Haredim. At least they were friends of the Haredim. A lot of them have Haredi family members. They're not our, rivals, certainly not our enemies. And yet, there was so much anger in the room. There was so much resentment. And one cannot help understanding and identifying with that resentment. Of course, the lack of service in the IDF on the part of Haredi society is a moral stain. And it's a moral stain that I have no pretensions of wiping it clean with some magic sponge. I don't have that. It's a moral stain which is there. I can explain why it's there. I can explain how it got there. I can try to allow or to help others to understand more of the Haredi internal motion that led to it, but it's still there. And therefore, I'm not here to excuse or to engage in apologetics. I agree, the numbers are problematic. At the same time, I think it's very important to understand, in terms of army service, I'll leave the other issues for now. I think there's significant progress in the other issues, but let's focus on army service, which has become the most crucial and of course, the most also volatile of these issues. In terms of army service, the army itself was not interested in Haredi integration into the IDF before October 7th. The army did not, I would say, initiate the kind of programs. I'm not saying not at all. There were here and there, and I'll be happy to speak about them later. Sure. But overall, the army was far more interested in the project of integrating women into the IDF, and in an aggressive way, in some would say a progressive way or a feminist way. Don't forget there's a Yoalamit, which is the special advisor to the army for feminist issues. And right now, because of the drive to integrate Haredim, so she's also up in arms. 1 minute, won't the integration of Haredim come at the expense of integration of women? Because Haredim need to have a gendered, meaning a same-sex
separation.
Yeah, same-sex environment. And in the past, when we spoke from Netzach Yehuda, when we spoke to senior army personnel about the tension between integrating women and integrating Haredim, they laughed at us. They said, this is some kind of joke. Our raison d'etre is to integrate women. Haredim, who wants the Haredim? Haredim are a headache. You have to worry about kosher food. You have to worry about these religious standards. You have to worry about prayer times and so on. Haredim are not coming into the army in the same way that the religious Zionist society generally, not all, but generally enter the army. Religious Zionists said, we're entering the army on army's terms, and we'll try to make the best of it. And they have, heroically. But the Haredim are saying, they're not saying we'll come to the army, but there's an understanding from the Haredi space that bringing Haredim into the army will require the army itself to be able to accommodate the Haredi norms in many ways. And the army was unwilling and just uninterested in doing that for many, many years. And that's why it just didn't get off the ground. There was an understanding in general Israeli society that it's much more important to integrate Haredim into the economy than into the army. And for example, in the finance ministry, the general policy, the general understanding was, let's just exempt the Haredim altogether from army service. We need a small and technologically advanced army. Mm-hmm. If we'll just exempt the Haredim, they'll be able to enter the workforce, because right now, or historically, there's been this arrangement that only Haredim who are in full-time Torah study are exempt from army service. As soon as you go to work, you have to go to the army. So the finance ministry said, okay, this is blocking Haredim from being able to go to work. Let's just exempt them. And then they'll be able to go to work. And that's the main thing. Meaning there was a different kind of mindset before October 7th. Right. Post October 7th, that has changed and changed radically. And today, rather than the economic integration agenda, today the army integration agenda has come to the fore. The army wants 2 new divisions, 20,000 soldiers, foot soldiers, meaning there's a real need and there's a real understanding that the entry of Haredim into the army is key for the army's own future, and therefore things have changed, also from the army's perspective. But one has to have that historical perspective to appreciate why this didn't develop so much, or why this didn't develop at the same rate as the other areas of integration, while at the same time mentioning that there's also a special sensitivity around army service.
I'd say also at the government level that the Haredim were valuable coalition partners, right? Israeli politics is quite volatile, and to sort of have a bloc that you can consistently count on trading with, we'll call it that, is useful to the governing power. But the issue of the draft has been a hot one within Israeli society for decades. So perhaps the government was willing to work on economic integration and de-emphasize the military aspect. But you've had lawsuits on this at the Israeli Supreme Court, and of course this relates to the fact that at the time at which these suits were finally heard, because there were a number that were initially rejected, the court was already in a position where it was expanding its power. And so suddenly an issue that was never previously acceptable as a judicial question became one. And that happens in the 80s. Also, the issue of standing expands radically. And so just a civilian is able to sue on this and start creating change, right? So, this is perhaps something that we can go into a bit later, but the Haredi issue and the expansion of the court power are quite linked. But regardless, you have suits going back starting in the 70s and all the way through today, and significant court involvement going back, again, decades, starting in the 80s. So this has been a priority within society, and certainly for, I would say, the judiciary and perhaps parts of the government bureaucracy for a much longer period of time. And they've played a role in the way that this has evolved. So can you draw on that lawyer hat that you were mentioning earlier and give us more of the history here, explaining the significance, for good and for bad, of the court's involvement?
Okay, sure. So first of all, it hasn't been for good. Okay? let's put that on the table. The fact of the matter, I think that's a very objective observation. I don't think that's deeply subjective.
That's what you call a softball.
No, the fact of the matter is that the court has been involved in this. The first case that was opened, okay, the court opened its doors to hearing cases on this particular issue for the first time in 1986. That was with this, we call it...
Yehuda Wrestler, who's a serial plaintiff, basically.
A serial petitioner. Right, constant petitioning to the Supreme Court. And significantly on this issue, this was very much a test case issue for this kind of, let us call it a public petitioner. Mm-hmm. Somebody who's coming not really with his own self-interest at heart, but rather with a question of public policy and trying to get the court to be engaged, to be involved in shaping Israel's public policy on key issues that are, of course, a subject of public dispute, of public engagement. And yet, rather than going to the democratic pathway of elections and coalitions and government, this is an alternative route of how do you influence, how do you shape public policy in Israel by going to the Supreme Court. So the first time the court opened its doors, in 1981, the court threw this out. The court said there's no standing and there's no judiciability, meaning it's not judiciable. It's justiciable, sorry, right? This is not justiciable. It's not a case, not the type of case that the court is supposed to hear. This is supposed to be decided at the Knesset and not at the Supreme Court, number one. Number two, the guy doesn't have standing. In 1986, he changed his petition a little bit. He said, well, I'm really suffering from this because I have to do more miluim. I have to do more reserve duty because the Haredim are not serving. So they said, all right, we'll give you standing.
Well, also, it's just, worth noting that it was, I think, Aaron Barak.
Barak was then president, correct. He became president.
So this is part of a larger process that which he led and in which he remained a central figure for
absolutely
decades.
For decades. And so in 86, the court accepted the petition, meaning opened its doors before the petition, but nevertheless, ultimately didn't accept the ruling went against Ressler in 86. But this came back in 97, I think. And then the court said, well, quantity makes quality. The court said that was kind of the slogan. Because it becomes so much, there are so many Haredim who are being exempted from the draft, this cannot continue to be dealt with by the defense minister. The defense minister used to annually renew these exemptions as a kind of administrational act, something very, very run-of-the-mill. And the court said that's not acceptable. This has become a big enough issue that demands, that requires an act of parliament. It requires a law, an act of legislation. Mm-hmm. And the rest is history, meaning 97, this ruling was given down. A committee was established under Tal. Tal was a former Supreme Court justice. He had very close connections to the Haredi space.
Really?
His kids are black hatters. They're kind of Haredi. They also served in the army. Okay, so they're a specific type of Haredi. But he's a person, he was a religious person, a person who's, deeply observant, but also a person with deep ties to the Haredi space. And therefore, he was the ideal person to head this committee. And he came up with the Tal law. The Tal law, I think, was a remarkable law. I think it was...
What did it say?
It had ingenuity. What it said very, very, bottom line, very briefly, was it said that Haredim can leave yeshiva for a year without having to draft, without having to go to the army. Under the arrangement, right, that the defense minister had been renewing every year. So anyone who's not in yeshiva has to go straight to the army. While the Tal law said, you know what, we're going to give people a year. You can go to work, leave yeshiva, go to work for a year. Then after a year, you have to go to the army. However, if you want, you can go back to yeshiva. Now, the idea, the wisdom behind this idea was that Tal understood that boys are not going to go directly from the yeshiva to the army. There's too much social pressure it's too outlandish. It's too going against the grain. For a yeshiva guy who's thinking about his learning, he's thinking about his shidduch, he's thinking about the family situation. Those are his thoughts. What's he thinking?
His shidduch is his match for marriage.
Yeah. His shidduch, exactly.
And
that's what he's thinking about in yeshiva. And going to the army does not align with those thoughts, with those ambitions. And that's why Tal understood, if we want to think about boys going to the army, let's get them out of yeshiva first. I'm not saying let's get them out, let's pull them out of yeshiva. Let's allow those boys who anyway are not really finding their fulfillment, finding their life role in Torah study, let's allow them to leave the yeshiva, and from there they'll go to the army. After 10 years, that law was struck. The Supreme Court struck the law. This was already under Banish. In the words of the court, the DNA of this law is genetically flawed. It's not working. And the numbers were not good enough. And therefore that law was struck. And basically from then, that was 2012, till today, we're in this very messy constitutional issue of finding a law and not having the ability to actually bring a law to Parliament which will pass the test of the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court ultimately, what did it say? That the law goes against the basic law of human dignity and equality. Human dignity and not equality. Human dignity and freedom. I say equality. Why did I say equality? Because equality is not in the law.
Right.
It was in fact specifically excluded from the law when this was at the Knesset table in whenever it was, 92. This was specifically excluded. The Knesset members said, we do not want equality to be in the law. And of course, the Supreme Court said, well, what can be more related, what can be more essential for human dignity than equality? There's nothing that negates dignity more than a lack of equality. Not every, I should say, the decision made distinction between two different types of inequality. But this type of inequality runs against, opposes diametrically the idea of dignity, and therefore the law was struck. And the rest is history. And until today, we're struggling to pass a law. That's the history of it.
I just want to, I think, expand for a second on this equality point, so that it's not misinterpreted. Because I think people that don't understand the way that Israel functions would say, well, if equality is not in the law, then surely there's all sorts of inequality that go completely unaddressed. And the reason that equality is not codified in the law is because Israel is so diverse, with so many different conflicting interests between various kinds of religious observance in various nationalities, that the fear was that putting a term as vague as equality into the law would simply allow for, well, rampant judicial activism.
Right.
The fact that the court was even able to strike a law down on the basis of equality, which relates to human dignity and freedom, relates to the court's own actions earlier in the 1990s in taking the basic laws, or the two basic laws at that time, which were not considered to be of constitutional weight yet, and declaring them to be constitutional, and in that way giving itself the power of judicial review. So the story of the Haredi draft exemption is one that's really, as I said earlier, bound up with the growth of judicial power in Israel, certainly of the court. And it's interesting to me to see the way in which these things developed within the law, because I don't think you could choose a better issue if you were the court and you were sort of designing a long-term strategy for how to both grow your power and in a way that was destabilizing various coalitions, not just even the right-wing ones.
Well, yeah, don't forget in 2019, 2020, we went through numerous election cycles.
Over the inability to reach a compromise.
And it was about this.
Yes, it was about this.
This is where it all began, with Lieberman being at war with, at the time, Litzman. Litzman was the representative of Ger Hasidus as a part of UTJ, United Torah Judaism, and because of their going at war with each other over this question of the draft law, that's why the coalition was disbanded, and there was an inability to actually create a stable government for years over this. And today we're back there.
No,
we're in the same place.
By the time that I had lived in Israel for 8 years, I think I had voted in more elections than I had growing up in the U.S.
Well, good for you, meaning that you're democratic. You managed to realize your democratic duties and privileges.
I had a different interpretation at the time,
sure.
But we'll go with this one. Yeah, no, but just to finish the point, I don't think there's a better issue that one could choose, because what you see or what you experience as an Israeli citizen is that this is constantly the subject of all sorts of political deals. There seems to be often an inability to move things from the outside on this particular issue for all sorts of perhaps good reasons and then less good reasons. And then you have a powerful body that comes in the name of equality and says, well, the situation has to change. It has to change now. Okay, this is, you mentioned a moral stain earlier. It's a moral stain. And so on the one hand, what they're doing substantively has had, I think, egregious political effect, but connects very deeply with a desire that many Israelis want to see fulfilled. And on the other hand, it's been, again, in the long term, both, I think, a violation of the rule of law, but extremely counterproductive for the workings of Israeli politics more generally, and also on this question.
So let me make a few points on that. This is
Make many points.
No, I'll make 3 short points.
That was more than I was thinking. Okay.
3 short points.
Yeah.
But one point is, yes, the court has seen itself, the Haredim do not have confidence in the Supreme Court. By the way, not just the Haredim, but especially the Haredim do not have confidence in the Supreme Court. And there's 2 reasons for that. One reason is because the Haredim look at the court and say, we're not represented there. The court's values don't represent our values. The court always comes from a liberal perspective, a perspective of liberal values that predicate human rights and individual rights. And often those are at odds with community values, with national values, with religious values. And therefore there's this lack of confidence. But there's a second reason, which isn't connected to values. Values is one point. And I think it's a legitimate and true perspective of the tension between the Haredim or the religious parts of Israel and the court. But it's not the only one. The other one is the institutional part. And what I mean by that is that the court inserts itself where it sees a power vacuum, where it sees, if you want, a kind of, in economic terms, we would call this a market failure. Mm-hmm. The court sees that the Knesset or the government is not able to bring to bear the will of the majority. And why is that? Well, says the court, because of the oversized power of the Haredim. The Haredim, like you said before, are wonderful coalition partners. Why are they so wonderful? Because they don't want so much. On the major issues of Israeli society, the national institutions, the public policy, the Haredim would say, we'll go with whatever you say. We just want to be able to water our back garden. The yeshivas, the communities, the housing issues of Haredi cities, those few issues which are not major. It's not big money. It's some money. And of course, you have to make some concessions here. But they're wonderful coalition partners. Everybody flirts with the Haredim in terms of forming coalitions. The left, the right, everybody. Because they're very stable, loyal coalition partners, provided you can give them what you agreed to give them or what they want. Mm-hmm. And therefore, they have outsized power in a coalition for those few issues that are so important to them. One of them being the army draft, right? The exemption from the army for Haredim. That's one of the basic key issues for which Haredim play the political game. And therefore, says the court, this is kind of a market failure, and we want to fix it. And that's why the court inserts itself into this place. And this is not necessarily because of the values, but because of the institutional issue that the court sees within Israel's governance. And I think the case of the Haredi draft is a prime example of that insertion. There's somebody who wrote a piece about this. I think his name was Cohen. But I think it's a very fair point to make. And of course, that creates a lot of resentment from the Haredim, because the Haredim say, 1 second, we're a part of the democratic process, we're a part of government, fair, we make a deal, and all of a sudden the Supreme Court comes and does something else entirely. Today, the Haredim are trying to make a deal with government. What are the Haredi rabbis saying? The Haredi rabbis are saying, you know what, we're not ready to make a deal. Not with the army, not with the government, because we know who the real boss is. The real boss is the Supreme Court. So how can we, in good faith, make any kind of deal when we know that it's ultimately going to be struck or going to be reshaped and reformed by the Supreme Court in a way that we have no control over? So on the one hand, that's what the court is doing. And yes, you're right, it represents a majority of Israel in terms of let's get the Haredim into the army. But on the other hand, it undermines the political process in a deep way. Now, 2 more very short points. That one was a bit long, but 2 very short points.
Okay.
One point is that it hasn't worked. Okay? Let's just look at this from an objective perspective. We've been in this game for 35 odd years, however many, it depends where you start counting from. We've been doing this for a while. The court's been involved in this process for multiple decades. Where has it gotten us to? Where are we today? Has this been a success? And I think the answer is a resounding no. It's been an absolute failure. I think that the court's intervention ultimately has hindered, damaged the process much more than it has stimulated it and pushed it along. We see the results. The results have been, like you say, negligible. No results. It's pushed back some of the positive processes that could have happened. It's put the Haredim constantly on the defensive. It's broken trust. It's been very problematic. And ultimately, the intervention or the insertion of the Supreme Court into this issue, it hasn't succeeded. And I think we can say that objectively. You can then try to think about why it hasn't succeeded. But objectively, look at where we are today. It hasn't worked. So that's one point. Just to put that on the table, it hasn't been a success. Second point is why hasn't been a success. And I'd like to just mention just one point on this. Again, we can have a lot of discussion, but one point, sure. A basic point. And that is that the government, before the court inserted itself, it would have been the responsibility of government to make sure that we come to an arrangement, to make sure that we get the Haredim into the army on some level, in some way. It would have been the responsibility of government, and the government is elected by the people. And then ultimately, it would have been the responsibility of the people to have that conversation, to hash it out, to reach a compromise, to reach something. Meaning that there's a reason why these things are decided within a governmental, parliamentary, democratic system, because democracy knows how to hash these things out and to find a solution. Once it becomes a very important issue, then it will be decided at the ballot boxes. And I think that the Tal law, just as a great example of this, the Tal law was working. People say, oh, it didn't work. It's not true. It was working. If you look at the vector, it's true the numbers weren't great. Why were the numbers not great? The Tal law had 10 years altogether. The first 5 years, it was like it was a dead letter. Nothing happened to it. It was stashed away in some government drawer by some clerk, and nothing happened. Nothing moved for 5 years because of the government. Let's be honest, it was inept, and because the army didn't do anything. So nobody did anything about the Tal law for 5 years. In the second 5 years, then there was already a minhelet, this kind of authority that was set up to actually execute the Tal law. And you know what? Numbers jumped from like 400 soldiers or something to thousands of soldiers. By 2012...
How many thousands?
8,000, 9,000. By 2012, there were thousands of, not all at the same time.
Right, because I
Not all at the same time.
don't
But
think we
at
had
the
more
same
than-
time, there were like 3,000 soldiers. It went up dramatically by 2012. Not dramatically enough to be called equality. Of course not. Equality is an abstract concept which is very difficult to realize in the field. And of course, there's no equality today. There's no equality between Modi'in and Tel Aviv. There's no equality between men and women. There's no equality between Hesder, religious soldiers, and non-Hesder. There's no absolute equality. Equality is difficult to realize. Anyway, the law was struck. I think that's a tragedy. That the Supreme Court struck a law which was a good law, and it was actually working. Just the pace wasn't good enough. And the pace wasn't good enough because of inept, forgive me, governmental policies and execution, and because the army wasn't very enthusiastic about it. But those projects that were initiated then, for example, I don't know, there was an Air Force project called Shachar Kachol. This is technicians, like technical roles in the Air Force. It worked. It brought in all these Haredim. Now, there were those that were naysayers and said, well, it's expensive, it's married people, it's costing us too much money. You have to think of the long-term goals. Projects like those, the person who led it was somebody called Eliezer Shkedi. Projects like those are wonderful because they normalize army service within Haredi society. They create an environment where it's legitimate to serve in the IDF. And the changes that are happening now in the army, vis-a-vis Haredi service. Think about Shlav Bet. Shlav Bet is not something that came from a law.
Explain Shlav Bet.
Shlav Bet, phase 2 army service, allowing Haredim to do, 3 weeks, 2 weeks, between 2 weeks and a month of regular army service, and then going into reserve service. Okay, so a lot will, look at this with a wry smile and say, big deal. This is not army service. This is not giving 3 years of your life for combat duty, okay? True, it isn't. But it's still crucial because it normalizes army service. And I have a brother-in-law, my wife's brother, standard Israeli Haredi, okay? And he did this Shlav Bet, he did this phase 2 army service. He's done 350 days of reserve duty away from his wife and 4 children, okay? And he comes home to his Haredi neighborhood with uniform. You know how significant that is? And there's 1,000, more than 1,000 Haredim that have done this. It's so significant. That didn't happen because of any law. It didn't happen because of court intervention. It didn't happen because of Miara, our
Attorney General.
Attorney General. There's 2 roles here in Israel. It didn't happen because of any of that. It happened because of an organic change within Haredi society. Of course, government can do more. Government should do more. One of the reasons why government doesn't do more is because we don't need to deal with this. The court, the court is dealing with this issue. This issue should be dealt with within society. It's a public policy. It's a social, deep societal issue that needs to be dealt with within society. And that's actually where the changes are taking place.
So we have 2 final questions, or we do have to be brief, I'm being told. But I want to clarify what you're saying as I understand it. And again, I identify with the optimism, and I also believe that big changes, again, they require some kind of prudent and incremental approach, and that the best and most sustainable change can come from the ground up. But is what you're saying, look, there's no way to do this except for the slow way. And despite the fact that we have a manpower deficit and all of these wars on our borders and so many people like your brother-in-law putting in extensive amounts of reserve duty and, sacrificing their life and livelihood, this is just the situation we're in, and it has to be resolved democratically and within the Haredi society itself. Is that effectively what you're saying, that we only have that we don't have a solution over the next X number of years? Because even these dramatically positive changes, we're still talking about really, really minuscule numbers compared to the number of Haredim that should be drafted. So that's one question is, what do you think actually has to happen to, within Haredi society now, first of all, to inspire the kind of change that's needed, but secondly, to actually meet the needs of the state of Israel?
Yes, believe me that I'm also frustrated, deeply frustrated by the pace of change. There's a lack of patience out there in Israel, and it's a lack of patience which is justified. It's not something that I can say, oh, guys, be patient. I get it. People are serving for the better part of a year, leaving their families. I'm not talking about the killed and the wounded. That itself is unbelievable. And believe me, I've been to Herzl tens of times.
It's the military cemetery
in Jerusalem, tens of times, just to identify, just to be there. And it's unbelievable to see the courage, to see the dedication of these families, of these boys. It's inspirational, it's mind-boggling. It's also deeply tragic. It's unbelievable. And we've been through a harrowing time. And of course, some of that frustration is funneled towards the Haredim, and absolutely understandable. So I'm not calling for patience. What I will say is the following. The numbers right now are not high, but we've only just begun. The army, the first ever hashpa'ah, swearing in ceremony for Haredi soldiers of this new Haredi brigade Hashmonaim was a couple of weeks ago. Okay, I was there. It was a deeply, deeply moving ceremony for me personally. I came in, and a couple of boys tapped me on the shoulder, and they say, Shalom Arav, hello Rabbi. I say hello, and I look back and I see these are two guys that I taught in yeshiva. One of the yeshivas that I established and I taught at for a few years, they studied in that yeshiva. Haredi boys, Haredi families. One of them was there with his father. Okay, all the families were there. But his father had also enlisted into the same brigade for a 6-month program that will upgrade his status to become a combat soldier. So both father and son were in the same brigade. It was deeply moving. Now, it was just established. This brigade was established now. It's going to take a bit of time. But I can tell you from the perspective that I have in Netzach Yehuda, where we have a lot of the boys that come to us, they come to our rabbinic staff and they consult. They want to know, what should we do? What can we do? There's a real motion going on within Haredi society. Boys that wouldn't have in the past contemplated doing army service are certainly now coming out of their, wherever they are, the corners of the yeshivas where they've been sitting, and they're saying, yes, we want to be a part of it. So the numbers, I don't think, reflect yet the kind of motion that we're seeing within. It's not good enough. It's not enough. I appreciate that. But still, it's important to say, number two, is there more that can be done? Of course, there's much more that can be done. Think about the incentives that need to be there for army service and the sanctions for those who are not serving in the IDF. All of those are legitimate. Those are legitimate. I'm not going to tell government exactly what it should be doing, but all of those should be out there. Meaning, if you want to stay in Torah learning, first of all, that needs to come with a certain self-sacrifice. And those who are not cut out for it enough, meaning they're not willing to make those sacrifices, then they should be going to the army. There has to be a new allocation or division within Haredi society. There are so many thousands who are not cut out for this full-time Torah study. They all should be in the army yesterday, but they don't have the incentives. One of the basic reasons why Haredim don't serve in the IDF is because they can, and the army the government hasn't been able to get its act together. That needs to happen at the ballot boxes. Meaning, if the government doesn't get its act together on this crucial issue, which is right now defining a lot of the social discourse within Israel, then let that be expressed at the ballot boxes and let action be taken. Of course, this can be expedited.
To be continued. Shalom Arav.
Toda. Thank you, Aylana.
That concludes this week's episode. We look forward to seeing you next time for another in-depth conversation on the big questions and legal debates defining Israeli society today. Thank you for joining us, and see you soon.